It's time for another installment of The Basics, and on today's show, in sticking with the Star Trek CCG, I want to talk about the seed deck versus the draw deck. Now, for some reason, there are a lot of people that build these two decks separately. I don't understand that. I'm going to show you why that's not a good idea. And some of this you might have seen on a previous episode, but it is still true. Let's get started, shall we? Now, it's been said that the seed deck and the draw deck are two completely decks within one. Yes and no. They complement each other, but you can't build one before the other. And I'm going to show you why using my Ferengi deck. I've taken it apart to explain this better. And as I've mentioned on previous episodes, when you start building a deck, first and foremost you have to choose the affiliation. The affiliation gives you your personnel and your ships, but it also allows you to choose the missions. So, how can you start building a seed deck when you don't even have your affiliation? You might have an affiliation in mind, but unless you actually have your affiliation chosen, as well as the personnel, because the attributes are needed to attempt and complete the missions, you cannot choose the missions. Everything else kind of falls into place for the seed deck after that. It'd be your outposts, the dilemmas that are going to go under missions, so on and so forth. In regards to cards that work in both decks and having to find out what works where, you have two main card types, and that would be doorways and artifacts. Doorways, some are used in the seed deck, some are used in the draw decks. In most cases, both. Artifacts, depending on the artifacts, are either going to be seeded, or in this case, they're artifacts like these two that are used as equipment or event cards. So they would be used in the draw deck. Again, the doorways and the artifacts need to be more tailored towards the draw deck, so you're not just going to shove them into the seed deck without knowing what you are doing here. Now, as a rule of thumb, when I build a deck, after I choose my affiliation, on one side of the table I will start working on the seed deck. On the other side of the table I will start working on the draw deck. And I'm looking at both decks as I'm going. That notwithstanding, if I have a side deck, I'm going to have another space on the table, which is empty here, where I will start assembling a side deck, but it needs to complement personnel, ships, as well as the power cards of the draw deck. Equipment are one of the last things you add into the draw deck, so I wouldn't worry about that so much. It's more important on how you're assembling the seed deck at the same time that you're assembling the draw deck, because, as I said, they complement each other. You just can't start slapping cards together. That being said, one of the last things you're doing with your draw deck are the power cards, so your interrupts or events. A lot of the events should be either set out to go after your opponent, enhance your own ships, or further the game, whereas interrupts, things I have here like the Barzan wormhole so I can move far. You have cards like long range scan so you can see what your opponent's up to, platinum payoffs and whatnot for bonus points, and of course your normal countermandas and cards that do things like that, i.e. your Kevin Uxbridge or your Kevin Uxbridge Convergence, if you have. But again, you can't really do that until you have most of this, including what you're working on the left side of your table with your seed deck. And this is why I don't understand when people say, oh, I build the draw deck and then I build the seed deck, or I build the seed deck and then I build the draw deck. That makes no sense to me. That seems extremely counterproductive. And by doing that, you're going to have to go back and rip both of those decks apart to make them work for your affiliation anyway. So why go through all that hassle? Another thing I could never figure out back in the days, we used to have a friend in our group of Star Trek CCG, when he was building decks, he would try to keep the card counts in his seed deck and in his draw deck at the same number of cards. That is completely bonkers, because that doesn't even work. You know you're going to have a certain amount of cards in your seed deck, i.e. 6 missions, anywhere from 20 to 30 dilemmas, 2 to 4 opponents and whatever doorways. The problem is with your draw deck, it's going to vary depending on the affiliation that the deck is, because you might have more personnel here, more ships there, or less of each. You might have more interrupts events. You might be heavy with equipment depending on the affiliation. You might have more artifacts. Trying to even the same amount of cards between seed deck and draw deck is just beyond ridiculous. Don't do that, ever. That's all for today. Have a great day, everybody.